the first question that we wanted to invite your thoughts on is what is the public sector perspective, in your opinion, on this urban heat dynamic? What key trends are you sensing, Sunandan?
Well, firstly, thanks, Francisco, for having me here. And I think that the response to that question has been clearly elaborated on also by Roop in her presentation. Just the numbers that she has shown, the kind of impacts that we have seen across different areas. Some of the feedback now that we've received from the breakout rooms, it's increasingly very hard now for public sector and the government at any level to really ignore the impacts that we are seeing on ground. So what we are seeing now is that there are, at an increasing scale, there are like the national governments as well as city governments who are developing heat action plans in terms of how do you then address when you are hit by a heat wave. I have to point out here also that there is always a bit of the discrepancy that we have between having a plan and implementing that plan. So that still does remain, but I think that it is now becoming really part of the narrative, and it's the common narrative. That makes it very hard for the public sector to ignore this. And just to throw in some numbers as well, and a bit more at the global stage, if some of the research is also showing, some of it that also what Roop touched upon, in terms of one is the environmental impacts. Of course, you're seeing wildfires and so on. That's having on the environment. From an economic perspective, again, Roop touched upon that, but I think there are predictions that by 2050, you're going to, due to heat-related stress, the economic losses at a global scale, and the global GDP is going to be about $2.4 trillion. So you're talking at really huge amounts. I mean, I don't think you can even imagine what these amounts are. But when you consider cities that really as epicenters of economic activities, there is going to be huge impacts if there is this global GDP impact as well. And also in terms of the social side, if you look at, there's the increased migration or the increased urbanization. I think it's study by UNICEF, if I remember correctly, looked at again that by 2050, I just need to correct myself, that the GDP impact is by 2030 and not 2050. Mm-hmm. And the social impact is actually, that they're saying, but the urban poor would be impacted by heat stress. The increase would be by 700%. So there are huge impacts on the environmental, social, and economic side. So the public sector governments are absolutely need to and are gearing up to respond to this.
No, thank you, Sunandan. I'm reflecting that I had the pleasure of attending something that ICLEI co-organized, which is the European Urban Resilience Forum earlier this year in Valencia, which is a green capital. And one of the consistent words I heard from city mayors, city official, public works personnel is polycrisis, 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 polycrisis. Social, human, migration, geopolitics, the natural environment. Yeah, can you maybe expand on that a little bit? It sounds as you were highlighting these different trends. Is that what you're sensing as well as cities formulate their agendas? Obviously, today we're talking about heat, we're talking about urban spaces, but I just heard a much more layered, interconnected, intercomplex perspective from chief resilient officers, from heat officers where they exist. Yeah, what are your thoughts on this?
So, I mean, that we need a more holistic and integrated approach to the challenges we face. I don't think that is something new. That's a realization that's really been there for a while now, and we've been talking about it for several years. But I think it's now that you're really experiencing the impacts of not working in an integrated manner, of not really breaking through the silos, of seeing how you are not insulated by just the activities that you do within your own jurisdiction, that something that happens outside your jurisdiction has significant impacts on you, whether it is political or whether it is environmental, whether it's a disaster, that it is going to have an impact on you. So it is where there is a clearer thinking now, and that's something that from a local government perspective that that we've really been pushing for, is that you need to work in a more integrated manner, which means that there needs to be much more dialogue, both at the horizontal level across the different actors, but even vertically. And it's the good thing that we are seeing now is, at least in the vertical space, is that at the parties of the national governments are also recognizing that the importance of bringing, sub-regional, provincial governments, city governments into the dialogues for the plans that they are making. I think a big initiative that came out of COP28 was, where they're looking at bringing them in from revising the nationally determined contributions, for example, by 2025. And I think that is at least a big step in the right direction. And I think there is an understanding that the crisis is at a scale where, and at a complexity where it cannot be handled just at one level. It requires working across levels of government.
No, thank you, Sunandan, for these reflections. Here on the call, I know I see about 31 people, and we have colleagues from different parts of our family. So we have colleagues from the Urban Climate Resilience Program. We have colleagues from the newer Zurich Climate Resilience Alliance. We have broader colleagues that are working in the heat space. As I mentioned earlier, some have developed strategies, some are emerging in their urban heat work. Can you comment as to the importance of alignment with city agendas? And I don't know if you have any examples from ICLEI or any best practices in terms of how to best align our current or future work with the city's agenda and what you're sensing in this space.
So I think the best way, I think there are good practices from all around the world that we are seeing increasingly, in which cities are now looking at bringing the heat risk factor into the planning processes. But just two things that I would like to highlight here is the whole point around that your responses are very context specific. I think that we heard also from the feedback in the previous session. And another element would be really the thing around multifunctionality, and that brings us back to dealing with the polycrisis that you're looking at. So what we are seeing in terms of cities now responding to this is, if you take a certain example from, let's say, Medellin in Colombia, where they've developed green corridors across the city. So what this actually helps to do is to channel heat from heat hotspots within the city out from those spots, helps dissipate that. But it also then provides a recreational space for people to go to, which we know has benefits in terms of for just health, mental health, as well as it helps increase biodiversity. So it is looking at these multifunctional solutions. Another example from Cape Town, for example, would be in low-income neighborhoods. They set up what they call spray parks, so they have fountains. And I think the critical element is also that they're setting it up in low-income neighborhoods, where children, teenagers, and people also with disabilities can access it easily, and just the cooling down, setting up these cooling centers over there. And that has a lot of social benefits as well, which are hugely intangible, while having the whole cooling impact. So you are, by that one solution, you are dealing, and it is also in terms of just the water usage, as we know, is much lower in these kind of spray parks than, say, swimming pools, which lower income communities cannot even access. So you're typically providing accessibility to these kind of cooling centers. And then it's all around also now we're looking at buildings, and for example, there's a lot of, when you talk about heat, there's a lot of talk about setting up cool roofs. If you look at Ahmedabad in India, where they have, as part of their heat action plan, they had this whole cool roof program, in which they were targeting residential buildings of the citizens. They're targeting government and commercial buildings, which they, as per the action plan, made it mandatory that they need to put in mechanisms by which they actually have a cooling element, and they had identified technologies that were relevant for their particular context, and also then putting in cooling measures, roof cooling measures for low-income housing. So I think that's where you are again, that you are being through those solutions, you're being able to target many other aspects in terms of housing, in terms of power, in terms of water, and so on.
No,
Health.
thank you for these diverse and rich examples, Sunandan, and certainly we take away the multifunctional and co-benefits perspective. Maybe just to stretch this point a little bit, it probably goes back to the unique context specific, but in terms of have you noticed overall that there's specific entry points into working with the city offices? I know from a Red Cross perspective, it's often disaster management, and through that, I've heard entry points through water and sanitation works, others through a sectoral perspective, so energy for mitigation or education or public health, obviously the heat health relationship. Is this something that it just depends on the city's agenda, ambitions, personas, or have you more consistently seen that these 2, 3, 4 areas tend to be, in a way, a bit more successful entry points for collaboration? I wonder if you have any comments on this.
So I would say in general, it really go back to my point of view that it is very context specific. So the best way to enter is where there is the greatest interest from the city, and then from there build it outward and say, include the sectors over there. And that's generally been our approach, because unless you're able to align it with the city's agenda, you're not going to have buy-in from them. The second way is also, I think, through a lot through the way IFRC works. When you're working through communities, of having that thing built up from a bottom-up demand. But I think that is where what is very important is to facilitate that kind of interaction and dialogue, say between communities and cities and provincial governments, cities and national governments, and so on, and taking that up to the global level again. So the point of the multi-level action that is really needed. But for that to take place, you really need to have the space for the dialogue around these things. And I think therefore creating that space is something that at all of these different scales across these different actors is another point of entry that we really try and use.
Thank you, Sunandan. Really drawing out where there's actual city interest or where there's momentum, there's drive. Obviously, all of us on this call firmly believe and lead and support bottom-up approaches and being key bridges and facilitating that dialogue that you're drawing out. I have one final question, but also would invite if someone wants to put an additional question in the chat or wants to raise their hand, maybe we still have time for 1 or 2 more questions. My final question is, and it's a tough one, Sunandan, what advice would you give to a program that is just beginning their urban heat work? What would you say are the top 1 or 2 considerations? Maybe you go back to some of the earlier points, but again, taking account that for a lot of us on this call, DRR, urban resilience are new topics, specifically urban heat, and maybe that closer link and intersectional perspective with the public sector, maybe new ways of working. What advice would you give?
So I think, given the people on the call and the experience and the hugely rich experience that they already have
for operation. Yeah, please.
I think some of the measures are not necessarily very new. So I think one of the things around heat waves that we always talk about is a multi-agency response, preparedness, and having that multi-agency capacities. But I think just the nuance with heat waves is that very often the impacts are not immediately or not so tangible as, say, in the case of a flood, and the impacts are not always diagnosed correctly, especially also if you're looking at in a health system. When you go there, maybe there's the symptoms of a heat related illness is not correctly diagnosed, and that also leads to deaths. There is also where people do not know. I see a heat alert, but I may not know how to respond to that as an individual or a household. So though there is the concept of a multi-agency response is not new to people here, I'm sure, but it is just the nature of the risk that is different, and therefore I think that would be something that I would really say that you need to keep in mind and use that as an opportunity of the work that you're already doing to build greater awareness around heat-related risks, to build capacities and understanding how do you respond to that. And therefore, you need to, again, work across scales and actors because it requires different actors to take different actions. So for example, the city sends out a heat alert, but the community needs to know what they need to do when they receive such a heat alert. The power utilities need to know that, okay, there is an increased demand that's kind of coming up, and how are we going to be able to deal with that? Water supply also the same. The health system, are they able to diagnose and treat heat-related illnesses? So you need all of these different actors to be able to play their role, to be able to respond to this. So I don't think that is not necessarily true, new, sorry, from say a flood thing, but it's just, again, the nuance in terms of the impacts that heat has, which may not be so direct. And I think to build that. And I think finally, what I would just want to say, a couple of points would be, given the work that you do, which is so locally led, I think at a global level, there is this huge interest now in locally led adaptation measures. It is something that all of you have been doing for a long time. And I think, but now you're seeing interest even in the larger funding opportunities where suddenly, the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, everybody is now talking about locally led adaptation, which IFRC itself and Practical Action and a number of the others over here have signed up to the principles of that. So I think that is another huge opportunity there. And finally, a number of agencies here are also engaged in, say, rehabilitation work after events and so on. So when you are undertaking those activities, maybe you just think a little bit about, consider heat as a risk as well. And so when you're building back better, how are you, just build the heat risk factor into it in terms of, say, building material, if it is a construction work, or ventilation for that matter.
So Nandan, really, really appreciate again your time and these insights that are again coming from different directions and, like you said, different scales. I think we still have maybe a minute or two. Any burning questions? Would anybody like to raise their hand and ask one final question? And after this, we'll have a chance again to go into breakout groups and have further reflections. But let's see the chat. Senor Jeff Woods, yeah, Jeff, please come in.
Yeah, thanks, Francesco. Sunandan, exactly what you just said, right? The whole idea of building smart, building for the future, not building for today or yesterday. The other side of that coin, though, is also, how I put it, slum upgrading. So how have the most vulnerable in many cities, including Nairobi, where I live, the most vulnerable live in slums where, the construction materials are basically heat sinks. Any experience or ideas around how best to help mitigate the heat in those areas, either through upgrades in construction or other ideas? Over.
Definitely. I mean, that's a great question, Jeff, and that is definitely a huge challenge. And I think that really speaks to the need for having this alignment with the city agendas and, in terms of what they are trying to do, and having that dialogue so that you're influencing the way, such in this case, for example, local housing for low-income housing programs are actually developed. So I do not actually have any direct example that comes to mind at the moment where this has been successfully done, but I know that there has been trials. I don't remember off the top of my head right now, Jeff, but yes, that is definitely a challenge.
Thanks, Jeff, for coming in. So with this, again, we extend a huge thanks, Sunandan, for these various insights and for taking the time to join us on this interview.